In 1990, John McEnroe was 2 sets to love up against Andrei Chesnikov in the 3rd round of the US Open when he decided that he'd had enough. He walked over to the umpire and complained that a fan in the front row was yelling in the middle of his serve. He then marched back to the baseline and entered into an expletive-laden exchange with the fan before a series of boos rang out around the stadium. Not for McEnroe, but for the fan. And it was an unusual moment, and certainly not because of McEnroe's short temper, but because, short of the odd round of golf, there aren't many other sports where something like that might happen. Can you imagine, for example, an NFL player complaining about a fan shouting during a play at the Super Bowl? Or baseball fans turning on a spectator for yelling during a pitch at the World Series? You see, this all raises the question, why is it that in some sports you're allowed to be loud as a spectator, but in others you're expected to be quiet? Before the Industrial Revolution in Britain, society looked like this. There were the upper classes, consisting mainly of the landed gentry and aristocracy. There was a small middle class, made up of people working as teachers or lawyers, for example. And then there was the working class, who would often work on the land owned by the upper classes. The vast majority of people were born into the class they would die in, and there was relatively little mobility to speak of. But in the 19th century, things began to change. The Industrial Revolution saw a massive expansion of the middle classes, to include businessmen, entrepreneurs, bankers, shopkeepers, merchants, lawyers, civil servants, doctors, clerks, and a host of other salaried professions. Many of the working class, meanwhile, shifted from working in the fields to the factories, and a host of industrial powerhouse cities were born. Social rank became an even bigger part of British society, and many of the new upwardly mobile middle classes felt keen to prove they belonged more with the people above them than the people below. And one of the ways they sought to do this was by sending their children to the same public schools as those in the upper classes. And it was at these public schools that many of the sports we know today were born. And by public schools, we rather unhelpfully, in Britain, mean certain types of private fee-paying schools. So at one of these schools, Rugby School, headmaster Thomas Arnold put senior students in charge of the games committee. The boys used this responsibility to create new games to play on rugby's vast playing fields, the most famous of which was rugby football, first codified by a subcommittee of 3 boys, one of whom was just 16 in 1845. The headmaster, Arnold, died in 1842, but his ideas spread quickly. 23 of his assistant masters became headmasters at other public schools in England, including Eton and Westminster, where the alternative form of football without the use of hands was first developed. And the games didn't stay in the schools either. First, the boys took them to university, and then they took them around the world. Tom Wills, for example, a former student at rugby, took the sport of rugby football to Australia and adapted it to create Australian rules football. While another former rugby pupil, Richard Sykes, took rugby to America, where it was later evolved into American football. And these sports started to attract an audience. But the problem was that these public school boys had been brought up to see sport as being about restraint in victory and graciousness in defeat. And suddenly they were faced with crowds who would cheer, chant, and celebrate. They began to complain of being hooted and jeered at by crowds who they would sometimes refer to as the unwashed masses. And some of them even wanted sport to be played without any paying spectators at all. Now, in many sports, these objections were drowned out, as the money that spectators did bring with them was too much to resist, but there were some that held out. The issue of spectators, for example, is one of the reasons that rugby football split into rugby union and rugby league. The northern industrial cities of rugby league wanted to welcome fans, commercialism, and noise to the sport, while the predominantly southern public school players of rugby union wanted the sport to remain about self-improvement and fair play in quietness. Fans were allowed into rugby union matches, but they were expected to act with a certain decorum. And while rugby union is no longer a quiet sport today, the legacy of it still can be seen in traditions such as respecting the kicker, where crowds fall silent to allow a player to concentrate while he takes a place kick. You see, and with these clashes, sport had now become yet another social indicator. What sport you played and how you played it were an unspoken way of proving which class you belonged to. This is why many of the upwardly mobile middle classes embraced tennis and golf in the late 19th century. These were sports that were seen as above the dirtiness or violence of rugby league and football. Instead, they focused on the self-discipline and fair play that had been hailed in the public schools. Tennis and golf had initially been played on the vast country estates of the landed gentry, but in the late 19th century, clubs began to open, where the middle classes could play too. The first tennis club opened in Warwick in 1872, and by the 1930s there were 3,000 of them in Britain, and golf experienced a similar boom. These clubs were not just places to play sport, but community institutions where bridge games, dances, and amateur dramatics would take place. Membership was highly exclusive, which was another of its appeals to those trying to establish themselves within their new social status. It was also precarious. Behaviour such as cheering or chanting was hugely looked down on, and could have you expelled from the club. And many of these traditions remain today. The official code of conduct at Wimbledon explicitly states that noise must be kept to a minimum. So each sport has its own history and own culture. But for many of the quiet sports, their silence speaks volumes about the elitist history that laid the foundations for the games that we know today.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to the best team of sports writers, reporters, and analysts in the world, offering exclusive stories and unrivaled insight.